A few weeks ago, I began the sermon with a famous quote. Those who don't know history are destined to repeat it. Since then, I've been thinking a lot about memory, what we remember and what we forget. I've been thinking about the stories we tell to others and also the stories that we tell to ourselves. I've been thinking about what we do with our history, what we pass on, and what we choose to overlook. This is Martin Luther King Sunday. I find myself thinking about what we remember and what we forget about the civil rights movement. And why? Earlier this week, I asked several people, all white, what was the pivotal moment in the American civil rights movement? What was the tipping point that turned consciousness and began the real work to erode apartheid in this country? Two people that I spoke with said it was the 1965 Bloody Sunday March on Selma, Alabama, and those stunning images of police beating the protesters, the images of dogs attacking the marchers. One other person I talked to suggests that it was the death of our young white Unitarian minister James Reeb, also in 1965. Some of you may remember he was attacked after going to Selma to respond to Dr. King's second call for a Selma march. He was beaten by a mob and sustained serious head injuries. The Selma hospital refused to treat him, and he had to be driven to Montgomery, where he died 2 days later. Another person I asked said it was when that black guy got shot in front of his house. I think she meant Medgar Evers, the great NAACP field activist assassinated in his driveway in 1963. But the majority of folks, all white, that I talked to said that Rosa Parks and her refusal to move her seat for a white man was the key event, especially since it led to the bus boycott that brought Martin Luther King into leadership. I bet most of our young people out there singing in community hall based on what they learn in school would offer Rosa Parks as the answer as well. Rosa Parks and her courage and stubbornness and planning is the stuff of a great story and has entered our national consciousness as probably no other event in the civil rights movement has. In fact, the U.S. Congress called her the mother of the modern-day civil rights movement. But when I asked several African Americans the same question, what was the pivotal moment? What was a tipping point that stirred consciousness and began the real work to erode apartheid in this country? The answer was very different. The event they all mentioned also happened in 1955, the same year as Rosa Parks' bus boycott. But the African Americans I spoke with, they said the pivotal moment in the civil rights movement, the tipping point, involved a name that is rarely repeated these days. It involved a name that very few of us from my generation and younger remember or have perhaps even heard. And if we have heard it, we don't remember it. Emmett Louis Till was a black kid, a pudgy 14-year-old from Chicago. Born in 1941 in the deep segregationist South in Webb, Mississippi, he was the son of Mamie Carthen Till, who raised Emmett with the ever-present help of her own mom, Alma. Emmett had lived with his mother and grandmother in Chicago since age 2, when they had moved from Mississippi. Emmett was a typical early teen in many ways. He was respectful of his mama. He was mischievous. He was good at art, sharp in science. He suffered from polio as a young child and stuttered when he got nervous. In August of 1955, Emmett and a cousin were sent for a summer visit to the home of their Uncle Moses, who lived in a little delta town of Money, Mississippi. Money, Mississippi was in the deep South. Now, although lynching, a common method of controlling African Americans in post-slavery South, was on the decline, Jim Crow laws strongly ruled the day. As many of us remember firsthand, persons of color could not use the same bathrooms as whites, sleep in the same hotels, eat at the same lunch counters, or take a drink from the same water fountain. Deference to whites was the norm, and in Money, Mississippi, most blacks spoke to white folks with the requisite "yes, sir," or "yes, ma'am." Perhaps even more pernicious, most African Americans in the Deep South were kept in economic servitude of some kind. Many were sharecroppers who worked lands owned by whites, barely a step above the slavery from which they had been freed some 90 years earlier. Now, a northern city boy, 14-year-old Emmett didn't have any experience with the cultural mores of being black in Mississippi. In short, he didn't know his place, and it cost him his life. 3 days after he arrived, looking to get some soft drinks and candy, Emmett and some other black teens stopped into Bryant's grocery and meat market. What happened inside that grocery store is not known for sure. It depends who's telling the story, African American or white. The owner of the store, Carolyn Bryant, claims that Emmett made vulgar and suggestive remarks to her, grabbed her hand when he paid for his items, and then grabbed her by the waist and asked for a date. Others claim nothing like that happened, and that the only crime Emmett committed was giving Carolyn Bryant a wolf whistle. A black man didn't whistle at a white woman in Mississippi. The town grapevine soon buzzed, and Emmett's uncle was scared. Rumors circulated that that Negro boy from Chicago would be taught a lesson. 3 nights later, when Roy Bryant, Carolyn's husband, returned from a trip, Roy Bryant and his half-brother, J.W. Milam, arrived at Emmett's uncle's house after midnight and went into the room where 14-year-old Emmett was sleeping. Using a flashlight, Carolyn identified Emmett as the boy who talked to her in the store. Emmett was taken by Roy and J.W. out of the house and thrust into a car. Later, Roy and J.W. claimed they released Emmett after a few hours. The plan had been to take him up the road, whip him, and turn him loose, teaching him a lesson in respect. But other witnesses later said that Emmett was actually taken by Roy Bryant, J.W. Milam, and a small group of other townies to a barn, beaten savagely, his tongue partially cut from his mouth and shoved down his throat, and then shot through the head. His naked body was tied with barbed wire to a 70-pound steel fan and then tossed into the Tallahatchie River. Emmett Till's bloated body was found 3 days later. There were attempts at cover-up, claims the body wasn't Till's. The sheriff tried to bury the body immediately, but Emmett's mother demanded her boy be returned to her in Chicago. And so he was packed into a box with ice and shipped up on train. In a later interview, she recalls walking to the funeral home to see her son's body for the first time and smelling the rotting corpse from 3 blocks away. Although the funeral director had been told by authorities not to let anyone view the body, Mamie Till forced him to open the wooden box. Her boy was unrecognizable. One eye hung from its socket, the other was missing. Only 2 teeth remained in his mouth, the others knocked out from the savagery of the beating. An axe had been used to crack the top of his skull, separating his face from the back of his head.